And I remember stopping and sitting there in the room with him and saying, God, why? Why? My name is Walter Maddux, and this is my story. I'm originally from here. I was born in Denver, but raised here in Pueblo. Don't really have much memories of my time in Denver. My parents moved here when I was very young. When I was born, my mother, ensured that, that we were raised in the church as well. On the other side of the coin, every story has two sides, was my father. He was more kind of forced into kind of going to the church. He didn't really want to, I believe, be part of the church, because later on he used to tell us, your mother made me go to church. And I found out early on as a kid that my father was a very violent man. He had a lot of anger. He was very abusive. He believed in very harsh punishment. It was about that time that it came time for summer camp here at church, and the kids were going to Horn Creek, and I got sponsored, and I went to Horn Creek, and I remember looking forward to it very much. And it was up there at that summer camp that I came to give my life to the Lord, and I just remember just feeling the Spirit of God upon that place, and just the anointing of the Spirit there. And it was so wonderful being up on that mountain, and it was one of those things where I never wanted to come down. I was happy, and I just being there and being surrounded by that much love, and accepting Christ into my life. I remember coming down off that mountain, and I felt like $1 million, and though I'd grown up in the church, this was the first time I had hit that age, and it hit home for me. And I remember the Lord speaking to my heart. So I came back down here, and I was feeling good, and I was very happy, and I was still super involved with the church. And so started hanging out with some guys that weren't the best influence. I had hit high school, and started drinking, and and I kind of fell out of the church. I got to that point of I can do what I want. This went all the way up into where I was a senior in high school, and I know I put my mother at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do with me. At that point, I was getting ready to go into the military. We had the recruiters come and say, hey, you want to join the U.S. Army? I took a position as a intelligence analyst. Everybody in the barracks smoked, so at that point in time I started smoking. Right, like, hey, you're smoking a cigarette, might as well smoke this joint with us, and we pass it around, and living life on the edge at the time. But I come back to town. My mother, being the kind soul that she is, had taken in one of my sister's friends. My mom's like, well, she was really needed. She'd been kicked out of her house, and she needed a place to stay, and so, she's staying here with us. Well, being the young, promiscuous adult that I was, I hooked up with this young lady who was now living at my mother's house in my old room, until one day they called me. I was in the barracks, and I got hey, Maddux, you got a phone call. It was this young lady who'd moved into my mom's house. Her name was Cindy. She calls, and I'm like, hey, how's it going? She's like, good, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? She's like, well, I'm pregnant. We were talking about her being pregnant. We both determined that, that abortion wasn't an option. So I said, well, if we get married, government will take care of all your medical bills and stuff. And she's like, okay, sounds good. I was getting close to the end of my enlistment, and I'd already made the determination I was not going to re-enlist in the Army. I was going to get out. About a couple weeks after me getting out, my first son was born over here at St. Mary Corwin. My dad at that point, and I tried to rekindle a relationship with my dad again. Now that I was drinking and smoking and I was a man, I remember one day in particular sticks out in my mind. I come home and I was high as a kite and half lit, drank probably a 6-pack of beer. And I remember walking in the door and my wife looked up at me and said, "Look at your son, look what he can do." And I remember him letting go of the coffee table and he walked over to me, and I remember leaning over to try to pick him up. And I was so drunk and stoned, I almost fell over. But I remember I didn't. I grabbed him and I remember picking him up and looking into his eyes and his eyes looking back at mine. And that's when I thought, what kind of a dad am I going to be? I made a commitment right then and there. I set my son down and I said, that's it. I'm done. I've got to clean up. I've got to get right. And I came to my mother and I said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I've done wrong." And she says, "Don't tell me, son. Tell the Lord. Apologize to God for what you've done." And I remember I came here and I wept on the altars and said, "Lord, forgive me for what I've done." Cindy got pregnant again. And we were very excited about her second pregnancy. We ended up having a little girl. I remember I pulled up to my wife's work and I went inside and I walked in the door. And as soon as I walked in the door, and one lady finally looked up at me and she says, "Don't you know? They've rushed your daughter to the hospital." I got to the hospital and I came in and I was in a sheer panic and I said, I'm here. And it didn't seem like it took long. And the doctor came in and said, "I'm sorry, we've done everything we could, but your daughter has died." The doctor looked at us and he said, "Well, it's this thing, it's this newer thing that that they're coming out, they're talking about now. It's called SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, where, the baby's just put down in the crib and, they stop breathing and they just don't start breathing again." Tried to get life back to normal. She ended up getting pregnant again. We had my second son, Jake, was born. Anyway, I find out my mother-in-law is in ICU in Chicago, Illinois. So before we could make it to Chicago, they called us and told us, "Your mother-in-law has passed away." And I remember Cindy saying, "I have got to go to my mother's funeral." I said, "We can't go. I don't have any time left." And even her doctor, the counselor she'd been seeing for so many years, he reiterated the same thing. He's like, "You are in no shape to go to your mother's funeral." And she booked a flight and she says, "Are you going to drive me or not to the airport?" So I drive her to Baltimore and I give her a kiss. I said, "All right, call me when you land in Colorado Springs. Let me know you're there safe." And she flew on in to Colorado Springs. I got the phone call, said, "Hey, I'm with your mom. We're headed to her house." Next morning I get up, I go to work, and my phone rings and I answer it, and it's a roommate we have, and his roommate says, "Hey, your mother just called the house looking for you. Something's wrong. You need to call your mother." And when my mother answers the phone, she's sobbing. And I said, "Mom, what's wrong?" She said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Got the paramedic on the line. He goes, "Hi." I said, "Are you the paramedic?" He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "I assume my wife has died." He says, "Yes, sir. I'm sorry to say your wife is dead." I ended up talking to Dr. Kramer, who was the coroner here at the time, and he told me, he said, "Your wife's routine medication in her depressed state was enough to push her over into heart failure. None of her medications were in overdose amounts." And now all of a sudden I'm a single dad taking care of the three boys all by myself in Maryland. And I'm like, what am I going to do here? Jake had come to me and had said, "Hey, Dad, can I go spend the night with my friend?" I said, "Sure, I'm going to be at work, and your brother, he's fine staying home by himself." I went to work and I worked a weird shift. I got off at like 1 a.m. Then I hear the front door open and I turn and I look, and it's Jake. And I remember I looked at my watch and I said, "What are you doing? It's 3 o'clock in the morning." He said, "Oh, I couldn't sleep, Dad, so I came home." I said, "Well, young man, it is 3 in the morning. Go get your butt in bed." I remember waking up, laying there in bed and looking at the sun and going like, man, the sun's sure bright. And I laid there for a little while and I started thinking, man, it's quiet out in the living room. And I got up and I walked out in the living room and TV wasn't on. There was nobody in the living room. And I thought, wow, I wonder if Jake had got up and went down to his grandma's. So I remember I opened the door and I stepped into the bedroom, and that's when I seen Jake laying on the floor. And I grabbed him and I drug him into the middle of the room and I started doing CPR on him, because that's what I do. And I was, come on. Live. And after several minutes of doing CPR, I came to him like, he's gone. And I remember stopping and sitting there in the room and saying, God, why? Why? And I remember just sitting there and I held him. I kissed him. Said, I love you. I love you. Jake had a grand mal seizure in the night after we went to bed. He'd had a grand mal seizure and had fallen out of bed. And the way he landed, he ended up just asphyxiating himself. He suffocated himself just by the way he had landed. And that was the cause of the death, was asphyxiation. I began to be very mournful. I grieved, and I grieved heavy. I began to pray, and I spent time, and I said, Lord, I can't. I remember God speaking to me and telling me, he goes, be okay where you are and allow me to do my work. And I had to say, okay, God, I trust you, and I'm going to turn the reins over to you and not try to fix it on my own. I had given it all to God. I said, you know what? I'm going to trust you, Lord, and trust you alone. And if I'm a single man from here on, then it's you and me, God. We got this. I don't need anybody else but you, and we can do this. God never left me through all of the difficulties, through all of the hard times. When I felt the most alone and I cried out, he was there. And that, God, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He means that, and he is. And as a good father, he loves you. He loves us. And he just wants to be with us, and he wants us to be with him. That is his heart's desire, is for us to be with him. And all he wants is, son, come to me. I'm here. I love you. I'll be here for you. You know, I don't blame him. I don't blame him for anything at any point. You know, some people say, well, aren't you? No, I don't. My God has had nothing but love for me. He has cared for me. He has comforted me. He has been there for me in all of the hard times, in all the times where I have not known what to do. He's got my back.